Well, when Pete Robbins asked me to talk, he didn't ask me to talk about me and Mark. So I hope you're not going to be disappointed, because tonight I'm talking about Mark's second great-grandfather, whose name is Solomon Chamberlain. He was born in 1788. So what was going on in 1788 in the United States? They were trying to get the Constitution written, right?
Microphone closer to her mouth. No, not that.
Trying to get the
Move that speaker. Move the speaker back so it's in back. No, backwards. Push it back.
Okay. The Revolutionary War, 1776. They didn't actually sign the peace treaty until 1783, 5 years before he was born. Lewis and Clark did their great exploration of the western United States in 1804 to 1806. When he was in his mid and late teens. The War of 1812 was in 1812 when he was 24. And none of these things are even mentioned anywhere in all of the histories of him that you read. But they're very important for the United States. Who was the president of the United States in 1788? Nobody was. We didn't have a president yet. Actually, George Washington took over in 1789. So, okay, now we do have an autobiography that he wrote himself. He wrote this when he was 80 years old. But he was born in Connecticut. His parents were born in Connecticut. When he was 20 years old, he married a woman named Hope, or Hopi, or Hope Still. All of those names are in the genealogical records. Their last name was Haskins. And his father died when he was 8 years old. And he said, for the next 10 years, I lived a very wicked life. It's playing cards, gambling, getting drunk, getting into fights. And he had the reputation of being a real troublemaker. But when he was 19, he had a vision about hell. Vision of hell, he said, alarmed me very much. And I decided to reform. In this vision, they were heating up little irons, red hot, laying their faces on them. Don't know where that came from, but anyway. Then a little while later, he had another vision of heaven with 3 heavens and their glories. And the glory of the third one was much greater than the glory of the other 2. Now, where have we heard about that before? Yeah. And he thought, if I could find somebody who would tell me what to do, what I needed to do to be saved, I'd give the whole world for it. And he asked around, he asked ministers, other preachers, nobody could tell him what to do to be saved. So he said, well, I guess I'll just go to God and plead for mercy. And if I go to hell, I'll go praying. So he prayed and prayed, but at length the Lord answered his prayers and said, Solomon, thy sins are forgiven thee. Go in peace and sin no more. Sorry. So, about in 1816, he had another vision. He was 28 years old at this time, he was married and had 3 children. He said, the Lord showed me in this vision that there were no people on the earth that were right. Faith was gone, and all the churches were corrupt. Furthermore, in the vision, I saw that he was soon going to raise up a church that would be after the apostolic order, that there would be in it the same powers and gifts that were in the day of Christ, and I should live to see the day. There would be a book come forth like unto the Bible, and the people would be guided by it as well as by the Bible. So how about that? So,
what year would that have been?
1816. 1816, this is when he had that vision. So he wrote a pamphlet. He must have somehow gotten an education because they didn't have any public schools back in those days. But anyway, in the pamphlet he wrote about these visions, and then he started going around teaching people about them and telling them they better be careful what they were doing and get themselves ready to join this church that was going to come forth pretty soon. I made inquiries through the countries where I traveled if there was any strange work of God that had not been on the earth since the days of Christ. I could hear of none. He bought a house in Lyons, New York, and we still have a picture of that house. And that's where he was living when he published this pamphlet. The porch and the garage on the other side are built on later, but it was just a square house at that time. So anyway, he was living in that house, which was right by the Erie Canal. He was going to go to Upper Canada to teach. So he got on a boat on the canal and started on his trip. When the boat came to Palmyra, I felt as if some genie or good spirit told me to leave the boat. Then the spirit told me to travel south, which I did for about 3 miles. I was a stranger in that part of the country and knew no one in Palmyra. It was about sundown, and a genie told me to put up for the night. And it was common in those times just to ask somebody, like the elders when they're going without purser script, can I stay here tonight? Will you give me something to eat? And so he put up at a farmhouse there, and the next morning, the people in the house asked him if he had heard of the Gold Bible. When they said Gold Bible, there was a power like electricity went from the top of my head to the end of my toes. The woman of the house spoke considerably about the Gold Bible that Joseph Smith had found. I said to myself, well, I'll soon find out why I have been led here in this singular manner. So he made his way over across the lots. The Smith's home was only about a half a mile from where he stayed that night. And he met Hiram. And when he entered the door, he said, peace be to this house. Hiram looked at me astonished and said, "I hope it will be peace." I said, "Is there anyone here that believes in visions or revelations?" "Oh yes, we are a visionary house." "Well, then I will give you one of my pamphlets, which are visionary and my own experience." So they called some people together. 5 or 6 men were outside and Father Smith. They came in and sat down, and Hiram began to read my pamphlet, but was so affected he could not finish. He gave it to a man, which I later learned was Christian Whitmer, and he finished reading it. I then began to preach to them that all churches and denominations were corrupt, and there was no church of God on the earth, that he would shortly raise up a church which would never be confounded and brought down, and would be like the apostolic church. They wondered greatly, "Who in the world has been telling you these things? We have the same things written down in our house, taken from the gold record." I said, "The Lord told me these things a number of years ago. If you're a visionary house, I wish you would tell me some of your discoveries, for I think I can bear them." They had just finished translating the Book of Mormon, and the Lord revealed to me by the power of the Holy Ghost that this was the work I had been searching for. I stayed there 2 days, and they gave me instructions, and then we went with Hiram over to the Palmyra printing office, where they began to print the Book of Mormon. They had 64 pages finished, and by their leave, I took them and went on my journey to Canada, preaching all I knew concerning Mormonism to everybody who would listen. I did not see anyone in traveling 700 or 800 miles that had ever heard of the Gold Bible, and I exhorted them all to prepare for the work of God that was about to come forth. As soon as the book was printed, I took 8 or 10 of them and went back to a conference that was being held for the preachers in my former church. I thought maybe I can convince them about this. There were 40 preachers there, and I labored with them for 2 days to convince them of the truth, but they utterly rejected me and told me to leave their meeting. Also at that meeting was some of my old friends, Brigham Young and his brother Phineas Young. The man that was in charge ordered me out of the meeting and off the premise, but Brigham and Phineas were kind to me. On my way home, I stopped at one of their camp meetings and contended with one of their preachers concerning the Book of Mormon. The preacher utterly condemned it and rejected it. He said, "If it was of God, do you think he would send a little upstart like you around with it?" While I was on my way home, I stopped at a Baptist church and preached to a large congregation there. They received the work, but there was no one to baptize them because the church had not yet been organized. Soon after it was organized in April the 6th, 1830, I was baptized in the waters of Lake Seneca by Joseph Smith. And that spring, I immigrated to Kirtland, Ohio. In the fall of 1831, I went to Jackson County, Missouri, where a lot of the new members of the church were meeting. Well, in 1833, we were broken up by mobs and driven out, suffered the loss of all things. Hundreds of my brothers and sisters, we settled in Clay County. Same thing, there I lost 3 houses and my plantation. Settled in Caldwell County, Davis counties. Finally, we were driven out of the state in the coldest part of the winter, suffering the loss of all things. Many times I had my life threatened in Missouri and been knocked down, some of my blood spilled by the mobs. Well, we settled in Nauvoo and remained there in peace for several years, built a temple. Then on June the 27th, 1844, a prophet patriarch were murdered. In 1846, we were driven out of Nauvoo. They had to cross the river Missouri, and then cross all the way across Iowa. And on the other side of Iowa, they stopped and settled for the winter at what they called winter quarters or Council Bluffs. While they were there, his wife, Hope, died 2nd of January, 1847. On April 1847, the first group of pioneers left for the valley of the lake to make the road and hunt a place for the saints. I was asked to be one of them. I suffered much from cold and hunger on that trip. Excuse me just a minute. I want to tell you a few things that happened on that trip. Sorry, I thought I knew the page. That's not it. There it is. One of the leaders of the groups of 10 was Norton Jacobs, and he wrote in his journal, Brigham Young was feeling bad because he had scolded some of the men. And so he called a meeting of the camp and said, the only one who has the legal right to find fault is Henry Sherwood. And if you have something to grumble about, you've got to tell Henry Sherwood, because he's been formally elected to be the chief grumbler. Jacob also wrote that this arrangement had an excellent effect in putting the check on some of the fractious persons, especially one by the name of Chamberlain, who all the time had been grumbling with his team or somebody or something. But after this, he became tolerably decent. Later on in the trip, when they got to Chimney Rock, William Clayton wrote in his journal, the evening was spent very joyfully by most of the brethren. It was pleasant moonlight. A number of them danced until the bugle sounded at 9 o'clock, signaling the conclusion of the day's activities. Then he continued to write, this is William Clayton wrote, Come, you sing. It was remarked this evening that we have one man in camp who is entitled to the credit of being more even-tempered than any of the others in the camp, and that is Father Chamberlain. He is always cross and quarrelsome, but the brethren all take it as a joke, and he makes considerable amusement for the camp. So Mark's not exactly like his great-great-grandfather was. Anyway, they arrived at the valley July 22nd to the 24th in 1847. And in August, a month later, 2 different groups left and went back to winter quarters. And they arrived there back in late October of 1847. 1847. Okay. Okay, in the spring of 1848, he left again, winter quarters to go to the valley. And he married a woman named Teresa Morse. And some places say they were married in winter quarters, and some say they were married in Salt Lake Valley. And I don't know which one's correct, but they had, Teresa Morse had left her husband who was traveling with the saints coming west. And I don't know what their problem was, but, I do. He wanted her to go into polygamy, and she said, forget it, I'm not going to do that. And it broke up their marriage. She took one of their sons, and he took the other son. But they both ended up in Salt Lake. Anyway, Teresa and Solomon had one child, a daughter named Zariah Louisa. She was born in Salt Lake City in 1829. In 1849, Zariah was born in 1849. In 1850, I thought I'd go to California and dig some gold to make myself and my family more comfortable. So he went to Sacramento and up the creek about 5 miles and began to dig for gold. I made $1 a day, but the boarding, or the food, was $1 a meal. So one morning I found if I stayed any longer I'd have to sell my mule and live on the proceeds thereof. And it was going to be another month or more before the water went down enough so they could really begin to dig for gold. So he thought he'd ask the Lord what to do. I knelt down and asked the Lord in faith what I should do. His voice came to me as plain as though a man spake and said, if you will go home to your family, you shall go in peace and nothing shall harm you. So I rose up and started with my one mule. He didn't even go back and get his clothes or his gun or anything. He just left. He didn't tell anybody that he was going. That year the Indians were more troublesome than they usually had been, killing and being killed every night. But I put my trust in God and in the power of the priesthood, which carried me safe through. Although I came all the way alone, me and my mule and my pocket knife. But the Lord was as good as his word and brought me through safely. Okay. So they were in Salt Lake after 3 years. The Chamberlain family was called to go to southern Utah with John D. Lee in November of 1851. They settled first in Parowan, and later they went to Harmony. And while they were there, Brigham Young made a tour down through that area and was accompanied by several of the local leaders to determine the condition of the saints. he wrote from Parowan, according to former arrangements, I started on our contemplated visits to the Upper Sevier and South County on the 12th of June, and he lists the people who went with him, and among them is John D. Lee and Solomon Chamberlain. And then in 1853, the governor of Utah, which wasn't a state yet, but sent 30 men and William H. Wall to go down in that area and inspect the military strength and visit the Indian tribes and see how they were feeling toward the whites. And this William Wall wrote, "At Harmony we received a hearty welcome by brothers John D. Lee, 2 other men, and Solomon Chamberlain, and were made to understand that we were at home. We had every attention paid to us that could be acceptable to a weary soldier." And then Beaver. Oh, thank you. When they went to Beaver, left Harmony to move to Beaver, Teresa Chamberlain said, "I'm not going with you, I'm staying here." And she stayed in the home of John D. Lee for 1 year, and after a year, she married him as his 18th polygamist wife. Polygamy, apparently, only 9 of his wives were still living with him at that time. Some of the others had died and some of them had left. So she didn't have to put up with that many of them. But, and Solomon went back and made several attempts to get Teresa to come back and live with him and their little daughter. But no way, she wouldn't do it. So in 1861, Solomon and Louisa, who was 11 years old, moved to Santa Clara in Washington County. Their home was a small 1-room log cabin located on the banks of the Virgin River. Shortly after they got there, Solomon came down with malaria and was very sick. There were no neighbors or no doctors, and little 11-year-old Louisa had to do the best she could to take care of him. One night, a terrible storm commenced, and it rained for 4 days and 4 nights. Everything was saturated. She was sitting by the bedside of her father when a terrible rumbling sound startled her. Peering through the door into the darkness, she discovered that the river was rapidly rising. Rushing back, she screamed to her father that their home was about to be washed away. He was too sick and discouraged to care. But he finally consented to get up and put on his ragged shirt and trousers. She dashed out in the rain and pulled a heavy workbench over from the side of the cabin to a big tree that was nearby. And then she ran back into the house and grabbed a box that had some notes and genealogical papers and tied it to a limb of the tree. Then she got a couple of pillows, and by then the cabin was completely surrounded by water. But she managed to get her sick father up into the tree and climbed up with him. The river continued to rise, the rain continued to fall. She held his head on her lap throughout the cold, long, dreary night. Watched the floodwaters surround the tree and wash away their house and all their belongings. So they had nothing left except the pillows and the little box. The storm ceased and the floodwaters subsided, but Louisa and her father stranded in that tree for 2 more days. An old Indian was passing by in a rowboat, saw their predicament, tried to help them. He got a loaf of bread and managed to throw it up in the tree to them. And later on in reporting the flood, a newspaper in 12th February 82 said it was with difficulty that they extracted Solomon and Louisa from their perilous condition, and as reported, a short time afterwards the tree was uprooted by the raging flood. So there they were, tired, sick, lonely old man, 11-year-old daughter, needed assistance, and ironically it came from a most unexpected source. John D. Lee, recognizing the needs of a brother, invited Solomon to his home, and they provided him comfort and attention. Even Teresa helped care for him. Long illness and exposure to the elements was too much for Solomon. After a few days in the Lee home, he died. His obituary reported, the history of his persecutions and drivings would embrace all the sufferings and trials through which the saints have been called to pass in the last days. He was full of faith and lived and died a saint, respected by all who knew him. At the base of the Brigham Young Monument in Salt Lake City, there's a list of those dedicated pioneers who arrived in July of 1847. Solomon Chamberlain's name is on that list. A similar list is on a bronze plaque up in the state capitol building. Solomon Chamberlain had been prepared to accept the gospel long before it was restored. Through the trials in Missouri and Illinois, he endured persecutions and danger without hesitation. No assignment was too difficult for him, and even the death of his wife in winter quarters did not deter him. Difficult journey with Brigham Young into the Great Salt Lake Valley strengthened his testimony. He followed the counsels of his leaders and assisted in the exploration settlement of southern Utah. His early visions had laid the foundation for his immovable faith in the mission of Joseph Smith, and his life was spent in defense of the principles he knew to be true. And he wrote, my faith and confidence in the doctrine and principles of the church are as good as they ever were, and in all the authorities of God's kingdom. I am perfectly satisfied with all things as they roll along. I feel as though my years are not many more in this life. I'm endeavoring to live every day in a way that I am willing to meet the judge of all the earth at any time. May God bless the authorities of the Church of Christ and all honest-hearted saints. Even so, amen. Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to say?
How was Mark?
Okay. Mark's father is Leland W. Redd. Leland's father is Wayne Hardison Redd. And Wayne Hardison Redd's mother is Sariah Louisa Chamberlain. And maybe I left out one generation there.
think that's right.
Good.
I think that's right.
Thank
Do
you.
you have a copy of that document that he created?
Yeah, you mean his autobiography?
Oh, the pamphlet.
Oh, yeah, I do. Where's that red? Where did I leave my red thing? Did we have a picture of it up there?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. There it is.
You can find the text of the pamphlet on BYU Studies. I found it on there.
If you look,
Solomon Chamberlain of BYU Studies, and you can read the text of it. It's quite lengthy.
it's also, if you just go on the internet, put his name in, it'll come up.
Okay.
In that one picture, there was a picture of those 5 men. Who were those 5 men?
Oh, I skipped over that part. I'm sorry. Yeah, let me go back and read that to you if you've got just a minute.
Obviously Brigham Young.
Brigham Young. In August of 1830, my brother Joseph Young, this is Phineas Young talking, my brother Joseph Young came down from Canada to see me. He had been there preaching and wanted me to come with him for a season. He came over to the States with the intention of getting me to go back with him, and we left for Upper Canada about the 20th of August, 1830. Passing through the town of Lyons, we called on an old acquaintance by the name of Solomon Chamberlain. We had no sooner gotten seated than he began to preach Mormonism to us. He told us there was a church organized and 10 or more were already baptized, and everybody must believe in the Book of Mormon or be lost. I told him to hang on after he had talked for about 2 hours, setting forth the wonders of Mormonism. That it's not good to give a colt a bushel of oats at the same time. I knew that my brother had a little idea of what he was talking about and wanted that he should have time to reflect on it. So that we tarried a short time with him and went on our way pondering the things we had heard. This was the first I had heard of the necessity of another church or the importance of the priesthood and baptism. But after hearing the old gentleman's arguments on the importance of the power of the priesthood and the necessity of its restoration in order that the power of the gospel might be made manifest, I began to inquire seriously into the matter. Soon became convinced that such an order of things was necessary for the salvation of the world. And another one by Phineas Young. I met a great number of my friends who had assembled for our annual conference. Among the number was my old friend Solomon Chamberlain. He told me he'd come to offer the conference the Book of Mormon, saying if they rejected it, they'd all go to destruction. But he was soon driven from the place by the voice of the conference. I think I did tell you that one. So missionary work had commenced even before the church's organization. Neighbors and friends who had been introduced to the restored gospel in the Book of Mormon told of their sacred experiences. Solomon Chamberlain and Thomas B. Marsh took copies of pages yet unpublished Book of Mormon with them on their preaching tours. Solomon Chamberlain's contact with Brigham and Phineas Young prior to the church's organization is likely the earliest documented introduction these two future leaders of the church had to this new book of scripture. And that's Brigham Young and his 4 brothers. See, there was Lorenzo and Joseph and Phineas and Brigham. Can't remember the name of the other one right now. But they were friends of Solomon Chamberlain even before the gospel was restored, and they kept their friendship with him all throughout the years after the church was restored. Thank you.
Thank you.
Vera Lee, you did us well. Did yourself well. This was absolutely phenomenal. And I don't know about the rest of you, but some of the things I've never heard of this having taken place. And talk about a way to build your testimony that the gospel was being prepared to be returned to the earth. And here this Solomon Chamberlain had received these visions saying that that was going to happen. That is absolutely amazing. Thank you so very, very much for sharing that with us. Now, before we let you go back for your desserts or your third dessert or whatever, we do need to, excuse me, we do need to do the drawing for the, I think I'm loud enough. We need to do the drawing for the gift certificate, the card tonight, and I usually like to pick on the youngest person that's here to do that, and I think probably you're the youngest one. So would you pick one of these tickets out, and you can't look at what your family has, just grab one and read it off.
519157. It's not my grandma's. Oh, no, hey, you don't.
5. See, you got it upside down. You're the 7-5. No. 519.
157.
157.
172.
Gosh, I don't know about this. There you go. Well, thank you. Again, I want to express my gratitude and appreciation, and I know I speak for the members of this chapter, for thank you for being here with us. We thank especially Vera Lee for her sharing with us these very, very special things and taking the time to prepare it and present it and show it to us tonight. Thank you very, very much.